Imagine waking up one day and the United States is gone. It's been taken over by the Canadians, the Mexicans, and various Caribbean islands. Wouldn't that be unthinkable? Well, at its peak, the Roman Empire spanned 3 continents, ruled over tens of millions, built highways that stretched across the known world, maintained the largest standing army on Earth, and engineered cities with running water, sewers, and stadiums that could seat 50,000 people. No one came close. Virgil put it simply, Roman people shall rule all nations without end. And yet, somehow, by 476 AD, a Germanic warlord had deposed the last emperor in the West. The Roman Empire had fallen, 10 centuries of history and culture gone in a flash. How could this possibly be? How could something so powerful just stop working? And what are the implications for us in America? Are there lessons to be learned? In this video, we'll discuss the immediate reasons, like barbarian invasions and military collapse. But those are not satisfying reasons, are they? On this channel, we like to keep asking why. For example, why were the barbarians able to win in the first place? Why was the Roman military no longer the unstoppable force it once was? What were the deeper reasons for the rot at the core of the empire? Well, let's get to it. Let's find out why the greatest empire in history fell. First, what do we actually mean when we talk about the decline of Rome? And when did it happen? Well, the empire's size peaked in 117 AD under Emperor Trajan, stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf. Over the next centuries, it slowly lost territory and control. In 235, it lost Dacia, modern-day Romania and Moldova. Then, in 260, it lost parts of Gaul, Spain, and Syria to breakaway empires. And in 376, it lost control of its northeastern frontier as Gothic tribes crossed into Roman territory. Civil wars, economic troubles, and foreign invasions chipped away at the empire's strength. Then came plagues, currency collapse, and the growing independence of provincial warlords. By the late 300s, Rome was a shadow of its former self. In 410 AD, a people from Germanic Europe known as the Visigoths sacked the city and looted it. The first time in 800 years, Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy. And eventually, in 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor and sent the imperial regalia, the crown and symbols of Roman authority, to Constantinople. In doing so, he declared there was no longer any need for a Western emperor. And just like that, Rome as we knew it was gone. The city of Rome itself would be ruled by various Germanic tribes, the papacy, and the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, each leaving their mark on the ruins of an empire. Let's start with the immediate causes, what finally brought Rome down. First, military overextension. At its peak, Rome stretched from Scotland to Syria, so it simply became too vast to defend. Maintaining garrisons along thousands of miles of frontier drained the treasury and stretched the army thin. The Roman military, once the envy of the world, was increasingly made up of foreign mercenaries with divided loyalties. Nowhere was this overstretch more obvious than in Britain, where the empire maintained over 370 military forts, not just to repel invaders, but to keep the restless population in check. The most famous of these was Hadrian's Wall, a 73-mile-long fortification built across northern England to mark the edge of Roman control and keep out tribes from what is now Scotland. It wasn't just a wall, it was a symbol that Rome had stopped expanding and was now simply trying to hold the line. Meanwhile, constant civil wars meant generals were often fighting each other instead of defending the borders. As a result, Rome wasn't just vulnerable, it was exhausted. By the 4th century, the empire had over 500,000 soldiers spread across a crumbling frontier, many of them poorly trained, underpaid, and stationed in remote regions where loyalty to the emperor meant little. Second, barbarian invasions. Barbarian was just a word for outside, anyone who wasn't Roman or didn't speak Latin or Greek and lived differently. So, let's meet the barbarians. The Visigoths and Ostrogoths were both branches of the larger Gothic people, a collection of Germanic tribes originally from regions around modern-day Poland and Ukraine. The Vandals came from even further north, possibly from Scandinavia before migrating south over centuries. These groups were semi-nomadic, ruled by kings and tribal councils, and centered around warrior elites. They wore furs and leather rather than togas, lived in wooden settlements rather than stone cities, and measured wealth in cattle and plunder rather than coins. Then there were the Huns, a completely different type of threat. They were nomadic horse archers from the Central Asian steppes, possibly from modern-day Kazakhstan or Mongolia. They didn't build towns or farms, they lived on horseback, herding animals and raiding settlements. Despite lacking Rome's massive infrastructure, siege engines, or formal training academies, these tribes had one huge advantage: mobility and adaptability. They could move quickly, strike unpredictably, and weren't weighed down by bureaucracy or supply chains. Roman legions, trained to fight in traditional formations, often struggled against fast-moving cavalry and guerrilla-style tactics. In 410 AD, the Visigoths sacked the city of Rome itself, marking the first time in 800 years the Eternal City had fallen to a foreign enemy. The Vandals, having crossed into North Africa and captured Carthage, took Rome again in 455 AD, this time from the sea. The Huns, under Attila, rampaged across Gaul and Italy, terrifying the empire despite eventually being repelled. These so-called barbarians, though less materially advanced, revealed just how fragile Rome's defenses had become. And finally, in 476 AD, a Germanic general deposed the last Western Roman emperor, and with that, Rome's long descent was complete. Now those were the immediate causes: the invasions, the defeats, the collapse on the surface. But to really understand why Rome fell, let's go deeper. And no one went deeper than Edward Gibbon, the 18th century historian, whose 6-volume Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire became the most influential work ever written on the subject. Gibbon said there are essentially two reasons for Rome's decline: loss of civic virtue and the rise of Christianity. Early Romans were tough, farmers who became soldiers, who then returned to their farms. But as Rome grew rich and stable, Gibbon argued, people stopped fighting for the common good. Instead, they outsourced defense to mercenaries and indulged in luxury. The Roman citizen, he claimed, became passive, more likely to cheer in the circus than serve in the legions. So, soon as public virtue is extinguished, he wrote, the people are prepared to submit to slavery. In other words, once the Roman people stopped caring, the empire didn't stand a chance. Gibbon also argued that as the empire Christianized, its values shifted, from public service to personal salvation, from civic duty to spiritual contemplation. Monks replaced soldiers, bishops replaced senators. Heresy debates took precedence over statecraft. He didn't think Christianity was evil, but he thought it distracted Rome at a critical moment. In his view, it promoted a kind of cosmic pessimism, the idea that the real kingdom was in heaven, so this one wasn't worth fighting for. It's controversial. Many historians today disagree, but Gibbon's take was bold, that the soul of Rome changed before its walls fell. But while Gibbon is revered for his scholarly work, today many historians view his conclusions as overly simplistic. The Eastern Empire embraced Christianity too, and it lasted nearly 1,000 years longer. Arguably, what really doomed Rome were two things. First, a decaying political system. Rome began as a republic, a state governed by elected magistrates, checks and balances, and a strong senate. But over time, that structure eroded. Power increasingly concentrated in the hands of individuals, first with generals like Marius and Sulla, who marched on Rome and rewrote laws by force, then with Julius Caesar, who was appointed dictator for life in 44 BC. By the 3rd century, emperors no longer even pretended to share power with the Senate. Succession became a matter of military loyalty, not law or meritocracy. Consider the Emperor Caligula and his absolute power. He drained the imperial treasury within a year on lavish games, gold-plated statues, and personal extravagance, then began executing wealthy citizens and seizing their estates to fund his spending. Once, bored during a set of gladiator games, he ordered his guards to throw in random spectators to be torn apart by wild animals. He built 2 massive floating pleasure palaces, declared war against Neptune, the god of the sea, and made it a crime for anyone to say the word goat in his presence, because it reminded him of how hairy he was. This kind of unchecked absolute power weakened the empire. As imperial power centralized, succession became less a matter of law and more a contest of brute force. There was no stable system for choosing emperors, only who could gain the loyalty of the army and hold on to it. The result was a revolving door of rulers, often brought to power by coups and assassinations. In the 3rd century alone, Rome saw over 25 emperors in just 50 years, many reigning for only months before being murdered or overthrown by rivals. Entire legions would declare their generals emperor, plunging the empire into constant civil wars, while barbarian invasions went unanswered. In 193 AD, the so-called Year of the 5 Emperors, one man literally bought the throne at auction from the Praetorian Guard, only to be killed weeks later. The empire wasn't just fighting outsiders, it was tearing itself apart from within, wasting resources and loyalty on internal power grabs while the frontiers burned. Over time, even the most powerful institutions tend to grow sluggish, risk-averse, and overly bureaucratic, making them vulnerable to more agile challengers. You see it in the business world. IBM dominated computing until it was overtaken by Microsoft, which was then disrupted by Apple. And now companies like OpenAI are challenging the old tech giants. Rome was no different. What began as a dynamic, adaptable republic slowly calcified into a rigid empire. Powerful, yes, but increasingly slow to react, and unprepared for the new threats gathering at its borders. The second thing that actually doomed Rome to failure was, well, you guessed it, money. Economics. As trade declined and insecurity rose, many elites abandoned the cities and retreated to self-sufficient rural villas. These large estates operated like miniature economies, growing their own food, making their own tools, and depending less and less on the wider empire. It was a survival strategy, but one that hollowed out Roman urban life. Once bustling cities filled with bathhouses, libraries, and marketplaces began to decay. Over time, the Roman villa evolved into the medieval manor, and a Roman citizen became something closer to a serf. This shift marked the slow transformation of Roman civilization into what we now recognize as feudalism. Rome's economy had also long relied on a constant influx of slaves, captured through military conquest. As expansion slowed and then stopped, so did that supply. Fewer slaves meant lower productivity, especially in agriculture, and a shrinking tax base. In response, emperors tried to squeeze more out of what remained, leading to currency debasement, rampant inflation, and increasingly desperate policies. Wage and price controls, hereditary jobs, and punitive taxation were meant to stabilize the economy. But instead, they trapped people in failing systems, stifled innovation, and pushed more citizens to flee or hide their wealth. Then there was climate change. Studies of tree rings and ice cores show a shift to a cooler, drier climate in the late Roman period, especially around the 4th century. Harvests became less reliable, and food shortages led to unrest. In frontier regions, colder weather pushed migrating tribes closer to Roman borders in search of land, triggering more conflict. The empire's delicate balance, political, military, and economic, simply wasn't built to absorb so many shocks at once. And finally, the plagues. Rome was repeatedly devastated by outbreaks, most famously the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd, which may have killed up to a third of the population. Fewer people meant fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, and fewer farmers, accelerating the collapse already in motion. In the end, what had once made Rome so successful, especially as a socio-economic system, simply stopped working. For centuries, Rome thrived by taxing its provinces without micromanaging them, allowing local elites to maintain some autonomy while still contributing to the empire's strength. Roman law, meanwhile, provided a foundation of stability and trust. It protected contracts, property rights, and inheritance, even extending many of those protections to non-citizens. This created a vast, integrated economy where people had incentives to build, trade, and participate. But as the empire declined, trust eroded. Autonomy gave way to extraction, laws became arbitrary. And without that underlying economic and legal cohesion, the machinery that had once powered a global empire ground slowly to a halt. So, what about us? The United States isn't Rome. The timelines, cultures, and technologies are worlds apart. But some of the patterns feel uncomfortably familiar. A sprawling global military presence, widening inequality, political dysfunction, and growing disillusionment with institutions. Rome thrived when it protected property, fostered opportunity, and integrated newcomers. It faltered when power concentrated, trust eroded, and everyday citizens felt squeezed out of the system. Are we witnessing echoes of that story today, or are the comparisons overblown? I'd love to hear your take. Let me know what you think in the comments.